Thank you. It's been really great to be here. Thanks so much for having me. It's been very inspiring as well. The first thing I remember, the thing I remember the most about some of these trips that I've taken is the wind. How much sand, how much of these Schammel sandstorms I've actually seen over my life. What you're looking at here is a sandstorm in the Middle East. This was one of the first big assignments I had in Iraq, and it was one of the most terrifying days of my life as well, and it's something I wanted to talk about today in particular. When you think about these Schammel sandstorms, they're made of this sand that isn't soft and granular, the kind that you might find at the beach out here, but rather it's a sand that is sharp and jagged, seemingly intended to damage and cause all kinds of pain. Stay out there for about a half an hour, and you'll be blind, you can't see. Stay out there longer than that, and the sand just gets through all your clothes, through your shoes, through your socks. It just gets everywhere. That's sort of what it's like when you're covering a war like I was in Iraq. On this particular day, because of this sandstorm that was about to turn day into night, we couldn't see our hands in front of our faces, and it also meant that we had no air cover. Helicopters couldn't come in to try and protect us should we need protecting, and quickly becomes a very frightening day as well. See that sand coming in, the last thing sort of is that little ray of light at the end, but pretty soon it turns completely dark. I was out in Iraq covering one of the stories that was one of the most impactful stories for me, both personally and professionally. It was stories of doctors known as devil docs who are out there supporting the Marines. They're naval doctors, and they provide medical support for the Marines. So many of the things that I've heard today, some of the things that Dean Kamen was talking about, I was reminded of, and some of these images remind me as well, about something that I referred to as sort of this human hierarchy. Doctors, nurses, corpsmen, risking their lives to save the lives of others. It's one of these things that I really never fully got my arms around, even in the several years that I've been to Iraq and several years since then, to really understand how it is on any given day. Someone will say, today I may potentially give my life so that yours can be saved. But that's what's happening out there all the time. These are the devil docs, and what they do is they run something known as an FRSS, a forward resuscitative surgical system. And basically this is a tent that within a couple of hours can be broken down and turned into a complete operating room. You got operating room tables, you got anesthesia, you got ultrasound, you can do all sorts of different procedures. But the real key to this FRSS is they move these tents right behind the frontline troops. The concept was pretty simple. They learned in '91 that it was simply taking too long to get some of the injured from the battlefield back to medical care, and soldiers were dying in transit. So this time what they decided to do was move some of these soldiers and these devil doc tents much closer to the front line. But as you might imagine, it raised all sorts of questions, all sorts of ethical considerations, the human hierarchy that I was talking about, but also taking some of the most precious commodities of a battlefield and putting it potentially in harm's way. I had all sorts of different experiences out there, but I remember one day in this particular Schammel sandstorm, you couldn't see your, as I said, your hand in front of your face, and we had these berms around the camp, and I didn't know what a berm was. I had no military sort of background the first time I was out there. They dig these trenches around the camps to sort of give a tactical advantage. So if someone is trying to come at the camp, they can sort of tactically be above that person. But if there is a breach of the berm, that means enemy forces have gotten into the campsite. So we're sitting there in the midst of all this darkness and this Schammel sandstorm, and we hear the berm has been breached. Berm has been breached. And I'll never forget, because I think that when you're out there in a situation like this, covering a story in a war or natural disasters or any of the sort of things that I've covered, I don't know, there's a sort of a sense of immortality about it, the sort of sense that nothing bad is really going to happen to me, the sense that there's all these people around me that I know, that I've gotten to know, that have become friends. Nothing bad's going to happen to them either. But on this particular day, the day of that sandstorm, it was looking pretty bad, and there was firefights breaking out all around us. What I often do is I often look to somebody who I sort of think is a natural leader and sort of see what that person is doing. It's something I've done since I was a kid, and I just want to see what other people are doing in a crisis situation like this. And there was this one guy, John Percivali. He's a captain. He was this tall, strapping guy, and very quiet, but one of these guys who was a natural leader. He just led by example. He never really said much. And as all these firefights were breaking out, I'll never forget, he was sitting there without his shirt on, playing cards. He was playing cards in his tent. And people were running in, screaming, saying, "Get down." And I remember he threw his flak jacket over his bare body and was still playing cards. And at some point, he got down on the ground. And he pulled out a piece of paper and a pencil. And he just started furiously writing. And I was sort of watching him and finally said, "Well, what are you doing?" He said, "Oh, I'm writing a letter. You should do the same thing." And I didn't have any paper. So I had to literally roll over on my back in my Kevlar jacket and find paper and a pen and start writing this letter. Now, I got to be the guy who wrote the letter and survived. But the reason I wanted to tell you the story is because it ended up being one of the more pivotal things in my life. I wrote that letter, I kept that letter, and I think it changed my life. I think everything I do, all the stories that I choose, the life that I lead, in so many ways is predicated on that letter that I wrote on that particular day. So I tell my close friends, and I've never talked about this sort of publicly before, but I tell my close friends to write the letter. Don't ever put yourself in harm's way like I did, but write the letter. It'll change your life. Something else happened to me when I was out in Iraq as well. It was sort of a collision of my worlds. You see, I'm a practicing neurosurgeon. Nowadays, my life is sort of spent 50% practicing neurosurgery and 50% being a reporter. And on one particular day, the devil docs with whom I was traveling came to me and said, "Look, we need you to take off your journalist cap and put on your surgeon's cap for a while." There weren't any neurosurgeons with this particular unit, and a young man had come in who had been shot in the head. The young man's name is Jesus Vidana. One thing that I've started to do a lot more, and I've gotten a lot better at, I think, since I've become a journalist, is really knowing the stories of my patients. Who are they? Where are they from? What are their families like? What are their aspirations in life? Jesus Vidana is a 25-year-old Marine from Southern California, not too far away from here. And on the day that Baghdad fell, he was out there patrolling, and it was really hot outside. And he took off his helmet just for a little bit, just to wipe the sweat from his hair. And when he did that, he got shot by a sniper right there. He was declared dead on the battlefield. And the medics went over, checked his pulse, could find none. And then, as the Marines like to euphemistically say, they cleaned up the place after that. And after they cleaned up the place, they went back and got Jesus's body, and they brought him into the Devil Docs camp, where there wasn't as much cacophony, and they could find a pulse and found that he was in fact alive. And that's when they came to me and asked if I would operate on him. It was obviously the right thing to do for me. We had no equipment, though. We had nothing to actually perform the surgery with. So the same drills that we were using to put up the tents, the Black & Decker drills, I sterilized those bits, put them back on the Black & Decker drill, and did an operation to remove part of the skull on Jesus's head. I took out the bullet in his brain and a blood clot that was pushing on his brain, and completed that part of the operation. In a desert, in this dusty desert tent, it's very unsterile, as you might imagine. I was really worried that if he did survive, he would have really bad infections, potentially life-threatening ones. So I took an IV bag, which was the only sterile thing in that dusty desert tent, and I filleted it open and used that to cover up the back of his head. Wrapped him up, put Jesus on a helicopter, and shipped him off, having no idea how he would do. It was an amazing thing. I had these experiences. I was flying back from Iraq and through Kuwait and then to Paris and then home. And I'll never forget, I was on the plane, and I think we were moving so fast for so long, we never had a chance to really process everything we had been through. So I was sitting somewhere near the back of the plane, and I was having really bad dreams on the plane. So much so that I was murmuring, I guess, quite loudly to myself. And the flight attendant finally came over to me and said, "Sir, you're being kind of loud." And I said, I'm sorry. She goes, "We're going to have to move you up to first class. It's a little quieter up there." Note to self. If you want to get upgraded, murmur loudly in your sleep. I was sitting in my office one day, and I got this call. It was a Southern California area code, and I answered the phone. It was a doctor. He called me, and he said, "Is this Dr. Gupta? I have an update on one of your patients here in Southern California." I said, I think you might have the wrong Dr. Gupta. As it turns out, there's a lot of us. And he said, "No, I think I got the right guy. Did you operate on a guy named Jesus Vidana in Iraq?" I said, my gosh, yes, I did. I hadn't heard about him in so long. And I didn't know what kind of shape he was going to be in, whether he was even alive, if he was in a vegetative coma, or what had happened to him. And I said, well, how's he doing? He said, well, he's got some left hand weakness, but other than that, he's doing pretty well, which was terrific news. I decided that I'd make a trip out to Southern California to go visit him one day, and I hadn't seen him except when he was all battered and bruised. And I knocked on the door. I called ahead of time, and he answered the door, and he's this, handsome, strapping guy. He gave me this big hug and invited me inside. And his mother came over to me, just a very sweet lady. She said, she goes, are you the man that operated on my son? And I said, yes, I am. She took my hands and sort of put them against her cheek, just very sweet, and she left. And his father came out a couple minutes later, and he said, are you the guy that operated on my son? He's kind of a blustery guy, and I said, yep. He goes, and you're a journalist? Fair question. We got through that, and I was sitting there, I was talking to him, and he was this guy that was sort of full of vitriol and just a blustery guy, like I said. And it had been some time since Jesus had returned, and I was sitting there talking to all of them. I wasn't really there as a journalist, but more just as this guy who was curious about their lives. And I started to ask his dad questions, like about what he thought about Jesus going off to Iraq and what he thought about when he came back and everything. And he told me this story that I'll never forget. And it changed the way that I think I have my own interactions with my own father. He said that, when he was leaving, Jesus was leaving for Iraq, they were kind of joking about it. They kind of didn't think, like I said, that anything bad would ever happen to him. And Jesus, as he was leaving, said, the only time you have to worry about anything is if a car pulls up to the front of the house and a couple of guys in uniforms come and start walking up to the front of the house. And Jesus' dad is sitting there telling me the story. He said one day he came out of the bedroom, he was getting ready for work, and he was sitting on the couch and he saw a car pull up to the front of the house. And these two uniformed soldiers got out and started walking up to his door. Now his door is completely glass, so you can see right through it. And they were knocking on the door, looking right at him, and he was looking right at them, but he was sitting in that chair, and he said he couldn't move. He was paralyzed. He couldn't get up and talk to these soldiers because it was the only thing he remembered that Jesus had told him. And finally, it was his wife that went and opened the door and got the news. As he was telling me the story, he just started to cry. It was a really touching thing because he was the last guy I'd expect to cry, and then Jesus started to cry, and then my cameraman started to cry. And I started to get a little choked up. And the mom was the only one who was sort of like composed, sort of kept it all together. But I think it's, there's this thing about fathers and sons, relationships between fathers and sons that I found when I do these stories in the United States and all over the world. Sometimes they're complicated. When I came to learn afterward is that they had never really talked about what had happened. And that was the first time that Jesus and his father actually discussed Jesus' close brush with mortality. I've had a lot of sort of experiences like this where my world sort of come colliding together. Over the summer, I was covering H1N1 quite a bit. Who you're looking at here is who many people believe to be patient zero, Edgar Hernandez. And I found him in a small town in the state of Veracruz, Mexico. He lived near a pig farm, and a lot of people believe that he contracted H1N1 from the pig farm. It's worth pointing out that swine flu is a misnomer. It's really not, it shouldn't be called swine flu because it's made up of 2 parts swine, but also 1 part human and 1 part avian flu. But what was so interesting about Edgar, that little cute boy there, who told me that he was cured by ice cream. He was convinced of this. He said he got really sick, but it was ice cream that cured him. He told me that he was fine. He looked perfectly fine when I saw him. And I got one of the greatest letters from a magazine editor when I got back, because I'd done these stories and been reporting for weeks and months. And he said the thing about showing Edgar Hernandez on TV like that, maybe not quite like that with the mask over his face, but just looking cute and fine, was that the nation sort of breathed a collective sigh of relief. People were so frightened of H1N1 for so long, and then they see this boy who got it, the first patient who got it, and he survived and was doing just fine. I covered the story all summer long, and then last month I was in Afghanistan covering stories of the devil dogs again, this time in Afghanistan. And my worlds come sort of colliding together because in the midst of all this, I myself contract the swine flu. So I'm in Afghanistan covering a totally different story, finally done with swine flu coverage, and I get the infection myself. And it was sort of the interesting thing where doctors sometimes really are the worst patients, because I was starting to develop fever. I got a really bad cough. I think the cough was the thing that I remember the most. It was one of those coughs where you just hack and it hurts and you wince and you just pray that you don't have to cough again anytime soon. I was living in a sleeping bag on the desert floor, and every time I tried to get out of my sleeping bag, I was so lightheaded that I almost fell down. Those are the things that I remembered. Eventually, I was swabbed and found, in fact, that I did have influenza A, which was subsequently confirmed to be H1N1. Now, I didn't get Tamiflu. I hadn't been vaccinated yet because the vaccines weren't available, but that was essentially my experience. And I think that as much as we talk about H1N1, actually going through it, I think, formulated some of my own opinions. One of them has to do with the question I probably get asked more than anything else as I report on H1N1, and that is, would I vaccinate my own children? It's interesting. I think a lot about vaccines, and I think a lot about my kids. I have 3 girls, and oh, that's me, by the way, looking really sick, I guess. I lost 8 pounds in a week, so the swine flu diet, I guess. But it can make you quite sick, but again, just a couple of miserable days, and then I recovered. With regard to my own daughters, I thought about this a lot. You'd like to have lots and lots of safety data before you'd ever recommend anything for your own kids. That's for sure, and I would as well. But I have decided to actually vaccinate my children because I've looked at all the safety data, and I think it's the right thing to do. We know that about 30% of the children who do get the infection and die were actually healthy. They didn't have any sort of pre-existing condition. So it's certainly something to keep in mind. And I sort of put it to you like that, just sort of cutting to the chase, because I think that's part of what our challenge is as medical reporters, to really try and transform information into knowledge. Jesse Dillon sort of talked about this a little bit today. This idea that at the end of it, what our viewers, readers, users want is actionable information, something that they can do something with. And what I've started to learn over the past few years, I've been doing this for 8 years now, is that there is this idea that something is happening in the world somewhere that could somehow improve your life. It can make your life longer, it can make your life more functional, and the question is, what is it? How do you know about it? How do you get that content? How do you get that knowledge? Well, that's part of what I do, try and provide that content for all of our viewers and all of our users on a daily basis. It can be a challenge, and I've sort of changed my views, for example, on the whole peer review process, the way by which we collect medical information. I think peer review of scientific literature should be more global, it should be more instantaneous, and it should be more immediately accessible. And I think that's what's going to really change the game as far as making the world a more functional and longer place. I think about this stuff all the time. It's sort of what I do now, and I get inspired by it quite a bit. When I was listening to Dean Kamen today, I don't know if you're still here, but I will come help you in anything that you want to do, Dean, as a doctor, as a journalist, just as an able-bodied person, to whatever you want me to do. Jesse Dillon, if anything that I said today makes any sense, call me. We can work on some of this stuff together. Mark, I told you that doctors aren't always the best communicators. I stutter a lot still when I speak. I have a hard time speaking in front of audiences like this. And one of the best examples I saw of how doctors aren't always the best communicators was this slide over here. This was an actual medical record. It pops up. No? All right, I don't have it. The actual medical record said, this patient has no history of suicides. True story. That's all that's in the record. Thank you very much. Leave it right there.